I think deep down, we have, as Europeans, like it's part of our DNA to have this sort of fear of the yellow peril. Like, going back to the Middle Ages, the hordes that came in from the east, the Goths, the Visigoths, etc., the Asiatic people that would come in through the steppes and, lay Europe to waste. It's embedded deep in our DNA. And so it almost feeds the whole, oh, China's going to take over the world, feeds into a sort of ancestral fear. And ByteDance is a company that's more than majority owned by US VCs anyway. So, when the US turns around and says, hey, we're going to shut down TikTok, like that is absolutely zero skin of Xi Jinping's back. It's like, yeah, what do I care? The joke in China is that the factory of the future will have a guard and a German shepherd. And the guard is there to feed the German shepherd, and the German shepherd is there to bite the man in case he wants to touch the machines.
大家好，今天要分享的是法国经济学家学者路易加夫近期一段访谈的节选。路易加夫在宏观经济与地缘政治分析领域具有广泛影响力。1999年，他与人共同创立了 GAFCA， 凭借在宏观研究、投资组合策略和全球政策洞察方面的丰富经验，将其打造成为全球最受尊敬的独立研究公司之一。数十年来，他一直为机构、基金和政府提供咨询服务。他和他团队的研究报告在资本市场也被广泛引用。路易加夫最引人注目的标签就是中国经济的长期看好者和西方对华误读的批判者。他经常在媒体上纠正西方对中国经济的偏见，并用详实的数据和逻辑来阐述他的观点。路易加夫是过去10多年里持续并坚定地预测中国将继续保持高速增长，并最终成为全球领先经济体的西方经济学家之一。他嘲讽和批判西方的中国崩溃论，认为中国的经济增长模式有其内在逻辑和韧性，在可预见的未来仍然是世界最值得关注和投资的经济体。我们来看看他在这段访谈中是怎么说的。
The U.S.-China relationship. It's obviously a super important relationship, the two biggest economic powers in the world, bar none. And it's a relationship that's in a constant state of flux. I think the relationship started to deteriorate very markedly around 2018. This is when the U.S. imposed a semiconductor embargo on China. This is when all of a sudden companies like Huawei, like ZTE were told you can no longer buy the high-end US chips. And this came as a big shock to Chinese policymakers. And since then, I think they've done everything they could to try to immunize their economy from potential other U.S. embargoes. Because if the U.S. can embargo semiconductors, it can embargo any number of things. So China has really spent the past 7 years trying to become self-sufficient and resilient in pretty much every single industrial vertical. And today, I think the leadership feels that goal has been pretty much achieved. Aside from very high-end semiconductors, China is basically self-sufficient in everything now. And I think this means that now China feels more comfortable pushing back against the U.S. You saw this very clearly in April when, you had Liberation Day and the U.S. bashes everybody with big tariffs. Most countries essentially folded under the pressure. It was definitely the case of the European Union. It was the case of Canada, Mexico, India, etc. China was pretty much the only country that stood up to the U.S. and said, look, if you want us to have a trade war, let's do it. And if you want to increase the embargo on semiconductors, we'll embargo your access to rare earths and to magnets. And all of a sudden, the U.S. realized that, yes, they could put pressure on China, but actually China could put pressure on them because without magnets, without rare earths, very quickly the plants at General Motors would go idle, and the ability of the U.S. to keep producing weapons would also be, at least the very high-end weapons, your sort of high-precision missiles and the like, would be deeply, deeply compromised. And so now I think you've sort of reached a sort of steady equilibrium between China, or maybe you could call it unsteady, but at least some kind of equilibrium, some kind of truce between China and the U.S., where they realize that they can both trip each other up, but that if they do, it's going to be very negative for both of them and for the whole world. And so this is really the backdrop that brings you to the meeting that's coming up at the end of October between President Xi and President Trump, a meeting that'll take place in Seoul at the APEC meeting, and which should open the door for President Trump to do a state visit of China in 2026. And I think once you get that state visit, hopefully the relationship will be set on a better footing.
With the backdrop of China, wanting to compete with the US, how does that sort of go moving forward? Will the US have as much power over China and other countries? Is the USA losing its dominance? How will the USA continue to interact with other countries around the world with the backdrop of China being able to evolve and, go away from its dependence on the USA? Will other countries do the same or not?
So I think, your first starting point should be that in the whole competition between nations, the U.S. really starts with pocket aces. The U.S., of course, is protected by two oceans. It has a river system that allows goods to be moved around all across the country, almost all across the country, like 2/3 of the country, at very low costs. It is self-sufficient in pretty much any major commodity that matters, whether you think of energy, whether you think of food, and so on and so forth. And if you tie in, frankly, the rest of the Americas, and most notably Canada, the U.S. is totally self-sufficient on all important commodities. So the U.S. has comparative advantages that are tremendous. And then on top of this, you can add, the dominance in technology, the cultural dominance, the fact that, English is the lingua franca around the world, and that the U.S. has some of the world's best universities, etc. So all this to say, you can never write off the U.S. It literally has pocket aces. And against that, China's attempt to sort of move up the ladder, China starts from rock bottom. You have to remember that in the early 70s, i.e. when I was born, not that long ago, people were literally starving in China. People were dying of hunger. And it is extremely, extremely impressive what China has managed to achieve in a couple generations, literally lifted itself from its own bootstraps through the sheer force of hard work and of an improvement in human capital such as the world has never seen. When you mentioned that I went to Nanjing University, when I went to Nanjing University, China was graduating 350,000 university students a year. China this year will graduate 12 million university students. You've never seen in one generation such an improvement in human capital. And so, to your question, what does that all mean for global trade and for the reality, I think, is that the past 70 years have seen the fastest growth in global trade. Here you're dialing in from Durham, from Duke University. You can right now probably go to Whole Foods and buy strawberries that are being made in Chile, and and oranges that come from California, and and cheese that comes from France, and any number of things. And this has meant an improvement in lifestyles all around the world. This trade has meant an improvement in lifestyles such as the world has ever seen. And now the reality is China today is getting a bigger piece of that pie. But the U.S. still has a massive piece of that pie. Maybe not for goods. So you go to Walmart, you're like, oh my God, nothing's made here anymore. But for services, the U.S. is by far the biggest exporter of services, bar none, really. When you think, of course, here you are, British, studying at Duke University. That's an export for the United States. Your parents are sending your dad's sending a check every month, or every semester. That's an export for the United States, as is the fact that, here we are, recording this on Riverside. You mentioned that you used Google to narrow down all my speeches in a way that you could digest without having to deal with hours and hours of listening to my monotonous voice. So lots, and there's the reality is, do we live in a world where trade is going to continue expanding, or are we going to put barriers? And on this front, I think there was a lot to worry about vis-a-vis the U.S.-China relationship. I'm actually more optimistic today than I was a few months ago. I think, like I said, the relationship is finding an even keel. This doesn't mean that you tomorrow will get the opportunity to buy a BYD car for $10,000. But that opportunity to buy the BYD car is now available to somebody in Chile or in Saudi Arabia or in South Africa in a way that it wasn't, 5 years ago. You were living in South Africa. You wanted to buy a car. The starting car was probably $20,000 whether it was a Peugeot or a Volkswagen. Now it's 10. Now you can buy a BYD for $10,000, and that BYD, by the way, is probably better than the Peugeot you were buying 5 years ago. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, for all the fears of contracting trade and conflicting blocks, etc., the reality is global trade continues to expand. It's just expanding in parts of the world that few people care about, whether it be South Africa, whether it be Indonesia, whether it be Colombia. It is expanding. Yes, a growing part of that trade is Chinese, and yes, as we move forward, less and less of that trade will be denominated in U.S. dollars. But these are like slowly moving trends. It doesn't mean that we have a crisis around just around the corner.
What do you think is sort of like the backdrop of this upcoming meeting with the US, imposing the 100K, amount for H-1B visas, which is, largely impacting a lot of Chinese people over in the US. On top of that, as you mentioned, China now has some of the most university graduates in the world. You mentioned 12 million. The essential pharmaceuticals still coming from China, and also the TikTok deal. What's the relationship? Is it, they're both China, and also what's going on with Taiwan, with China, with President Xi also wanting the US to say, this is your land. What's sort of going on here? Are they all just trying to put their cards out on the table in order for that deal? Like, how is this relationship? What's going to happen in the next month or so leading up to that deal?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. So let me first start off with an observation as someone who's been in and out of China for 30 years. That in the Western media, China is always doing one of two things. It's either imploding, or it's about to take over the world, and there's no in between. There's no in between, and sometimes, by the way, you get the same the two articles in the same article, the two arguments in the same article. It's imploding, but it's about to take over the world, and it's this deadly threat that we need to worry about. So yeah, just one word of caution. And by the way, I think somehow it's only China. You never see articles about Brazil or about Britain or about anybody about how it's either A, imploding, or B, about to take over the world. We have a sort of the Western world, and especially the Western media, have a very binary outlook, very Manichaean outlook, all black or all white on China.
It drives clicks.
Oh, for sure. It drives clicks. And look, I think deep down, we have, as Europeans, like it's part of our DNA to have this sort of fear of the yellow peril. Like, going back to the Middle Ages, the hordes that came in from the East, the Goths, the Visigoths, etc., the Asiatic people that would come in through the steppes and, lay Europe to waste. It's embedded deep in our DNA. And so it almost feeds the whole, China's going to take over the world, feeds into a sort of ancestral fear. If you go back to the 19th, earlier 20th century, the portrayals of China it was always yellow peril all the time. The portrayal of China in the movies up until not that long ago, the Fu Manchu characters with, like plotting away. And so it's deeply, deeply embedded in our Western DNA to look at China with a lot of fear and apprehension. And Napoleon himself said, let China sleep, for when she awakes, she'll take over the world, and all that stuff. So deeply, deeply embedded. Now, to your other questions, I think that the TikTok thing is interesting because it's it seems to be a huge issue in the U.S. And I think it's probably a huge issue with, frankly, people of your generation, because you guys are big users of TikTok. It's really not that big a deal here. And, the Trump decided to make it a big deal. Trump decided, look, they've got to sell this or we're going to shut it down. And Xi Jinping was like, yeah, fine, I don't care, shut it down. Because, you look at ByteDance, it's not even a quarter of their revenue. TikTok USA is not even a quarter of their revenue. And ByteDance is a company that's more than majority owned by US VCs anyway. So, when the US turns around and says, hey, we're going to shut down TikTok, like, that is absolutely zero skin of Xi Jinping's back. It's like, yeah, what do I care? And so the U.S. decided to make a big deal out of TikTok, and this is now a way, essentially, for China to give something to the U.S. because Trump sort of fought himself into a corner on this one, because if he does shut down TikTok, your entire generation of people in the U.S. are going to be really, really pissed off. Like, politically speaking, this would be extremely, extremely negative for President Trump to shut down TikTok. So he now needs to find a solution. And for Xi Jinping to give him a compromise on this is a pretty easy give, because again, it's no skin off his back. It means that the shareholders of TikTok, again, basically, I think I'm quoting from memory, but more than half is US VC firms, and a quarter is essentially the founders and the employees. So, it's like these guys are the ones who essentially get the shaft when they move to spin off TikTok for a US entity. Again, for Xi Jinping, doesn't care. Question is, what does he get on the other side? Now, I think if you're Xi Jinping, there's a number of things that you want from the United States. And the beauty for Trump is that none of them you write on a piece of paper. None of them you do an agreement with. But the first thing he wants, I think, is, having the 7th Pacific Fleet literally parked right outside your maritime border is a pain in the neck. And so he wants that removed, number one. Number two, he wants the sale of high-end precision missiles to Taiwan to stop. So if he can turn to his own Politburo and said, look, I sat down with Trump, and the 7th Pacific Fleet is no longer going to be parked right on our front yard, and they're going to stop selling high-end precision missiles to Taiwan, and they're going to stop sending politicians over to visit, which, by the way, they have. Since Pelosi came over, there's been no visits. For Xi, that's a win vis-a-vis his own Politburo. So that works out well for him. And then the other wins, of course, the other big wins would be lightening up the semiconductor sanctions, number one. I think the other big win for him would be if they got rid of some of the tariffs. And here, the obvious thing they can get rid of, China right now has an extra 20% because of the fentanyl tariff. Basically, Trump came in on the very first day, said, look, China's not doing enough to control the exports of the fentanyl precursors into the U.S. Going back to your point on the impact of Chinese medicine, China's not doing enough to block those precursors. Ergo, Trump could turn around tomorrow and say, okay, China's done a great job. We're getting rid of the fentanyl things. Then China moves from 50% to 30%, and then it's fine. So there are pockets of agreement. Now, what does Trump need aside from the TikTok deal? What does Trump want aside from the TikTok deal? I think what would be nice, what he did mention during the campaign, but which has since fallen off seemingly, is the idea of China investing in the United States. On the campaign trail, when he was still the candidate, Trump said, I want BYD to open factories in Michigan, and I want, Li Autos to open factories in Tennessee, and Longhe Machinery to open tractor factories in Iowa. This has now completely fallen by the wayside, but I think this would be the kind of thing that Trump could then claim a win. It's like, if he cuts the ribbon at a BYD factory in Michigan, that creates, I don't know, 20,000 jobs. You can say, hey, I brought this here, which for him is good. I think the other thing they're really looking for now is, frankly, guarantees on the rare earths and the magnets, because very clearly they've now identified that this is a key weakness that they didn't perhaps, I think they knew they had it, but they didn't realize the extent to which they had this weakness. So all this to say, there's lots of ground for potential agreements, for common ground. Now that the temperature has come down a little bit, I think we're in pretty good stead.
A lot of the US's growth wasn't just because of their expertise, knowledge, and know-how, but actually because of their advances in energy and having electricity to be able to drive through so much advancement. With China now having double the amount of electricity, as you just described, compared to the US, alongside that, President Trump has ended a lot of subsidies in the US for renewables and kind of, focused more on drilling again and, focusing on non-renewables. What do you think will be the outcome of that? Of China focusing more on renewables, more renewable energy, the US focusing more on non-renewable energy, the China having double the rate of energy of the US. Will that lead to China outpacing the US? What will be the relationship between those two with that?
So, look, my starting point in a lot of my research is that economic activity is energy transformed. In fact, you could say really that there's kind of 5 big building blocks to creating growth. One of them is the cost of energy. The other is the cost of labor. The third is the cost of land. A fourth is the cost of capital. And your fifth is the cost of government. So when you're an entrepreneur, when you're trying to build anything, these are really the 5 big inputs that you have to contend with. And by the way, the cost of government takes many forms. One way, of course, is taxation, but the other cost of government is through regulation. If the government keeps throwing regulation your way, keeps adding up the cost. So you think cost of land, cost of labor, cost of capital, cost of energy, and cost of government. Now, I would argue that today, when you look at China, China has a cost of labor that has come up a lot in the past 20 years, but it still remains below that of the United States. But the cost of labor now in China is roughly the same as you'll find in Spain. It's really not, the days of, cheap Chinese labors are well behind us, which is why, you've seen Chinese businesses move very rapidly up the value chain in terms of automation. For your listeners who have time, they should go to YouTube and just type in, Xiaomi dark factory or BYD automation. Like you have videos on these factories that are absolutely mind blowing. There's a factory just outside Beijing, a Xiaomi factory. So Xiaomi produces cars and produces phones. And they have a phone factory that I think churns out, 3 or 4 million phones a year, where there are literally no employees. The factory it's called a dark factory because they don't need to have lights on because the machines obviously can work in the dark. The joke in China is that the factory of the future will have a guard and a German Shepherd. And the guard is there to feed the German Shepherd, and the German Shepherd is there to bite the man in case he wants to touch the machines. So you have, as labors come up, the industrial robotization of China has also moved up very, very quickly, which thus means the cost of energy becomes ever more important. The more like these machines, again, go to YouTube, check out the BYD factories, the Xiaomi factories, or whatever else. Like these are highly, highly energy intensive factories. So yes, having a cheap cost of energy matters tremendously. Now, the US had a super cheap cost of energy, much cheaper than everybody else for the past 15 years, thanks to the shale revolution. This was a huge boon on many fronts. First, of course, for industry, having a cheap cost of energy is good, but for the consumer, the fact that electricity bills plummeted, that gasoline bills plummeted, etc. This meant that the Fed could maintain a very easy monetary policy for a very long time because there was no inflation. So the Fed could print money aggressively. That money would end up in higher asset prices, which would end up boosting growth, and you get into a very virtuous cycle. Now, the reality is that this virtual cycle is coming to an end in the United States. Unfortunately, when you look at the energy equation in the United States, really you've had very little investments in the overall energy infrastructure in the U.S. really since the shale, a bunch of the shale plays started going bust, and you had massive consolidation in shale from essentially 2013 to 2018, And during that period, let's not kid ourselves that regulations kept making it harder and harder for people to deploy capital in the energy space. It was the whole ESG thing. Investing in carbon was, if you were investing in carbon, you definitely didn't say so at dinner parties because you wore it a little bit as a badge of shame. And so this brings you to today where, U.S. oil production is peaking. You look at a field like the Bakken in North Dakota, it's now producing roughly 300,000 barrels less than it was 5 years ago at its peak. Most fields in the U.S. seem to be peaking, and this is occurring just at a time when now suddenly AI is going to draw massively onto energy. And so if you're the U.S. and you got that energy equation, today you could say, okay, well, the increase of, the demand in energy from AI means that the consumer is going to have to pay higher electricity bills, the whole supply and demand thing. So the consumer is going to have to pay higher electricity bill. I think politically that's very dangerous. That's very dangerous. So a lot of people, low-end consumers will say, well, hold on. Why am I paying higher electricity bills so that, the Jeff Bezos and the Bill Gates and the Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk of this world can buy themselves another yacht, rocket, plane, whatever it is? Why do these guys are making huge bets on AI and I'm having to pay higher electricity? How does this work? Kind of thing. So that's your first option. Your second option is to say, okay, let's curtail this AI thing and let China run away with it. But politically, that's not possible. Your third option is to say, well, look, let's move the AI, a lot of the data centers and whatever else to the Middle East. They have cheap energy there, so we can move it to the UAE, to Saudi, to Qatar. That was essentially President Trump's visit in earlier this year. The risk you take, of course, is if AI really is this big thing of the future, do you want to outsource and put in one of the most geopolitically unstable parts of the world all your data centers? Or the fourth is you have to find a way to produce a lot more electricity very quickly, like not in 10 years time, like with nuclear, that'll take 10 to 20 years, but literally in the next few quarters, and to do it cheaply. And I think this is where the U.S. is heading, because that's the politically smart thing to do. And the way you do it is you go back to coal. You just burn a ton of coal. And I think that was essentially what Trump signaled at the UN last week when he came to the UN and said, you know what, all this climate change thing is a hoax. All you guys who fell for it are bozos. We're not falling for it, and we're going to proceed. You read between the lines, what he was saying is we need a whole lot more electricity, and we're going to get it from coal. For me, that's as clear as day. And so if the U.S. wants to compete with China, and of course it wants to compete with China, China spent 20 years building up their electricity infrastructure. The U.S. does not have 20 years. The U.S. has a year, maybe two. And the only option on the table is coal.
If you were advising investors over the next, not just 6 to 12 months, but more 5 to 10 years, what do you think will be the outcome of the Mag 7? Do you think there will still be this incredible growth from them? Do you think there will be other companies like mining doing really well? And do you think people should be having a more globalized approach with a bit of money in the UK, China, South America, US? Should they just be focusing on China? What would be your rhetoric and focus on that?
So I'm going to make like a Jesuit priest and answer your question with another question. I would say, what do you think is the big macro trend that's going to reshape the world for the coming years? Now, if you live in the Western world today, and we've just spoken for an hour on AI. That's the macro trend that you hear about all day, every day, that you're already adjusting to in your daily life. You mentioned how you use ChatGPT and you come back to it, etc. So that's one macro trend. And I would say that's a macro trend that is likely today very well priced into the market. But there's other potential macro trends out there. For me, sitting where I am, sitting in Hong Kong, you can see the harbor behind me. One of the more interesting developments of the past few months is how China and India seem to be committed to repairing their relationship. A relationship that's been, really a bad relationship for 50 years or more. Now, we can question whether that commitment is for real or not. But if it is for real, then what you have is a possibility where Russia, which is good friends to both China and India, Russia produces the world's cheapest commodities. China produces the world's cheapest capital goods and cheapest consumer goods, and also benefits from the cheapest cost of capital. And India needs capital and has the world's cheapest labor. Now, you match those three things together: cheap capital, cheap commodities, cheap labor. You have the making for a potential explosive boom, a boom of epic proportion. Now, here's the fun bit: is you take the top 30 companies by market capitalization in the world. Out of your top 30, 24 are American, six are foreign. One of these is Saudi Aramco, one of these is TSMC, one of these is Samsung Electronics, one of these is Alibaba, one of these is Tencent, and the last one is ASML. Now, so these are your top 30 companies. How many of these companies are going to participate in this boom that you see unfolding in the economic integration between China, Russia, and India? And the answer is very few. Alibaba will benefit, probably Tencent may, Saudi Aramco may, Samsung probably will as well. But it's only a handful that will really benefit from this unfolding boom. And so I actually think this integration is the most important macro trend for the coming years. And it's one that's absolutely not priced into the market. It's not priced in the commodities market. It's not priced into the value of a lot of shares. It's not priced into the bond markets. It's not priced anywhere. So there's many different ways to play it. But yes, having a portfolio that's concentrated massively to the United States, because today you buy the world MSCI, you're essentially buying 70% United States. You're buying what has worked for the past 15 years. You're buying the tech boom of the past 15 years. And again, if you think the tech boom of the past 15 years was just a stepping stone for the next excitement of the next 10, then you're fine. Just keep buying the S&P 500 and go to bed, and you don't have to overthink it. If you think, no, the world is going to change in front of our very eyes, we're going to see an explosion in trade, but an explosion in trade that is not centered around the U.S., that is not centered around the U.S. dollar. We're going to witness an explosion in infrastructure spending and capital spending, but none of that will be happening in the United States. Then yes, you need to be exposed to the Chinese market, to the Indian market, to the British market, to lots of other markets out there.
路易加夫说，经济活动是能量的转化，能源成本是创造增长的5大要素之首，而中美正是在这一项上的差距越拉越大。我们简要来说说其背景。过去15年，页岩油气革命使美国成为全球最大的石油和天然气生产国。廉价的能源为美国工业带来了成本优势，压低了通胀，为美联储实施宽松货币政策创造了空间，形成了能源、金融增长的良性循环。但目前这一循环正在断裂，页岩油井衰减快，需要持续投入巨资钻井以维持产量。近年来，由于环保压力、ESG 投资兴起、资本开支纪律性增强以及优质区块的减少，美国页岩产业投资不足，导致主要油田产量见顶甚至下滑，维持高产量的难度越来越大。而这又偏偏赶上人工智能带来的前所未有的能源需求的激增。一座大型数据中心的能耗极其惊人，相当于数十万家庭的用电量。这股新需求与紧张的电力供应形成了尖锐矛盾。 加上美国落后的基础设施投资，国家电网老旧，输电线路建设缓慢，可再生能源并网存在瓶颈，这已经成为严重拖累美国经济发展的因素之一。与之相反，中国在过去20年里以集中力量办大事的模式，建设了包括特高压输电在内的全球领先的电力基础设施，确保了能源供应的基础容量和远距离调配能力。中国的总发电量已是美国的2倍，并且拥有世界上最庞大、最现代化的电网系统。中国民众感受最直观的就是，最近这些年已经没有夏天空调用电高峰时民用和工业生产要错峰用电了，停电这种事基本上已经被消灭。中美在能源这一块的差距可能会越拉越大，正如路易加夫指出的，中国拥有20年时间积累的能源基础设施优势，美国现在想追赶，但留给他的时间已经不多了。建设核电站需要10到20年，大规模铺设可再生能源配套电网也需要漫长周期。在政治压力和竞争焦虑下，美国决策者认为，唯一能快速低成本的大规模提升集合电力的选项就是重启和依赖煤电。这种孤注一掷是美国在自身结构性短板和紧迫的时间压力下做出的一个矛盾的选择。它或许能解一时之渴，但也有可能是一时之渴。所以现在西方媒体和学者开始更多的关注和分析中国的5年规划，解析中国强大的产业政策背后的逻辑和执行力。因为大国的竞争归根结底是战略耐心、系统规划和基础能力建设的竞争。